All right, thank you everyone. Our third speaker today, Katie Chenoweth, joins us from Princeton University, where she is Assistant Professor of French. Katie Chenoweth's research is situated at the intersection of literature philosophy, media studies, and the history of the book, and focuses on the Renaissance and contemporary French thought, especially deconstruction in the work of Jacques Derrida. In addition to being co-editor and co-translator of Geschlecht III, Katie is the director of the Bibliothèque Derrida at Éditions du Seuil, a collection that includes Derrida's unpublished seminars and other posthumous works. Katie is also the director of Derrida's Margins, a very exciting digital humanities project dedicated to archiving Derrida's personal library, now housed at Princeton's Department of Rare Books and Special Collections. Beyond her essential work as editor and director, Katie's first book, The Prosthetic Tongue, Printing Technology and the Rise of the French Language, is forthcoming with the University of Pennsylvania Press. In it, she charts the technological reinvention of the French mother tongue that begins in printers' workshops during the first half of the 16th century. Her current book project, Strange Flowers, radical quotation from Montaigne to Derrida, is under contract with Northwestern University Press and reassesses the importance both of citationality and Montaigne's essay for modern thought. Katie has published articles on many topics, including Montaigne, Derrida, and media history, and is co-editing a book called Theory, Translation, Universality, Contemporary Debates with Fordham University Press. Today, she will be presenting Faute de Frappe, Derrida's Typos. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you so much, Adam, for putting together this terrific event. Thank you to the university for having us. It's very cool to be here, especially in such close proximity to a bathroom. I think you must have chosen for us explicitly the Ein Geschlecht bathroom.
Yes.
All right, so I'm just gonna go ahead and start. I have two brief epigraphs. The first one comes from the dawn of the typewriter, from a letter written by Friedrich Nietzsche not long after receiving a typewriter as a gift from his mother and sister for Christmas in 1881. And the epigraph is, "Our writing tools are collaborating on our thoughts." So this philosophically scandalous sentence about the way that's Kittler, who calls this sentence philosophically scandalous, this philosophically scandalous sentence about the way the typewriter participates in and imprints itself on thinking was itself written on a typewriter, a Malling-Hansen mechanical writing ball, the first mass-produced and commercially available typewriter. Nietzsche is famously the first philosopher to write with a typewriter. It's also worth noting, I think, that he's also one of the very first people in Germany to own one, period. Nietzsche, an early adopter of the machine that, according to him, makes itself a collaborator in our thoughts. And the machine which moves typography, right? So typography is not new. Typography has been around since the mid-15th century, right? So already for several hundred years by the time we get the typewriter, but what the typewriter does is to move typography and thus also the typographical error out of the print shop and into the hands of the writer-thinker. And it's no accident that the English term typo, which appears in my title, that English word typo, an abbreviation for typographical error, which itself as a kind of abbreviation of typographical error already seems to be born of a typographical economy, and which would seem even to posit error of the essence of the type or of the typewriter. It's no accident that this word typo is coined in English in 1891, right, as the typewriter comes to be commonly used just a decade after Nietzsche gets his Christmas writing ball in 1881. So saying this thinking by Nietzsche is contemporaneous, more or less, with both the commercial availability of the typewriter and the word typo itself. Before moving on to my second epigraph, I also want to flag in passing a word that Nietzsche uses here, Schreibzeug, which we will see again in a moment. It shows up, you may be thinking to yourself already, it shows up in Heidegger's discussion of readiness to hand and being in time, where it denotes, not as it does here, the typewriter, but for Heidegger, the Schreibzeug is the tools or equipment of handwriting, the pen, the writing desk, right? It just is a kind of term that could mean any writing tools, writing equipment, the things you write with, writing things, it's sometimes also translated as. This Schreibzeug is also going to show up in the pages of Geschlecht II, where Derrida quotes the passage from Being in Time before recalling Heidegger's later and famous denunciation of the typewriter from his Parmenides seminar, where we will find, according to Heidegger, the typewriter destroying and degrading the word, quote, tearing writing from the essential realm of the hand, i.e. the realm of speech. So if for Nietzsche the typewriter is an active participant in thinking, his verb here is mitarbeiten, a working together or a co-labor of thought. For Heidegger, there can be no thinking and no language where the typewriter scatters logos into a signless cloud. And I also want to note that we don't see it here, but those verbs that I just evoked, quoting Heidegger, destroying, degrading, what the typewriter does to language, should already also, I think, resonate with the decomposing, degenerate Geschlecht, right? And we'll see those two come together. My second epigraph comes from an interview that Jacques Derrida gave in 2001 at the École Normale Supérieure, where he agreed to discuss at length and in detail in a very autobiographical register, in a confessional register, his own practices of reading and writing. And he confesses, I type very quickly, very badly, and I make many mistakes. Je tape très vite, très mal, avec beaucoup de fautes. So, this brings me to the subject of my talk. I'd like to look today at something that, to my knowledge, has rarely been acknowledged or discussed in Derrida scholarship, probably because it risks seeming merely accidental or biographical, not in any case a serious or properly philosophical or even properly literary concern. Namely, the fact that when Derrida types, as he did for all of his seminars and other texts beginning in the late 1960s, he makes a lot of typos, beaucoup de fautes, as he confesses himself, and faute de frappe, that French word for typo. What I would propose to do today is, in fact, to read Derrida's typos, his faute de frappe, in the Geschlecht series specifically, but also elsewhere, in order to move toward a thinking of the typo as the condition of any type or any typos. So I hope that you hear, if you haven't already, my title, Derrida's Typos, both in English and then also with some Greek as a possible other, not only Derrida's typos, but Derrida's typos. And I want to say here the typo as the condition of the typos. For starters, this typo talk that I'm proposing will help us, I hope, better understand the relationship that's not always clear between Geschlecht II on Heidegger's hand and Geschlecht III with its reading of Heidegger on Takel. As you'll recall, an important section of Geschlecht II is dedicated to Heidegger's privileging of handwriting and the denunciation of the typewriter that I have already alluded to. As Derrida points out, for Heidegger, the privileging of handwriting or Handschrift over the mechanical typed copy relies on an essential alliance for Heidegger between the hand, speech, and logos. And moreover, all of these as proper to the human. Hence already a relationship we can see forming between the typewriter and Geschlecht, the question of Geschlecht. But Derrida points us more explicitly in G2 toward the importance of the typewriter for what he's up to in G3. And I don't have this quote for you, I'm just going to read it. This is Derrida from Geschlecht II. Typographic mechanization, he's saying for Heidegger, destroys the unity of the word, the integral identity, the proper integrity of the spoken word, that manuscripture, both because it appears closer to the voice or to the body proper, and because it joins letters together, conserves and gathers together, right? So there's an integrity of the spoken word that handwriting conserves or preserves, that typographic mechanization destroys. He elaborates further on this gathering, Derrida does. First, he quotes Heidegger, and this is, you have a piece of this quote here, writing in its originary essence is handwritten. Writing in its originary essence is handwritten, handwriting, manuscripture, Handschrift. Then Derrida adds, I will add what Heidegger does not say, but which seems to me to be more decisive still, a manuscripture that is immediately bound to speech, or what is more likely, to a system of phonetic writing, unless what gathers together Wort, Zeigen, and Zeichen does not necessarily pass through the voice, and unless the speech Heidegger speaks of here is essentially distinct from all other phonae. This distinction would be strange enough to warrant emphasis, and yet Heidegger does not breathe a word of this. He insists, on the contrary, on the essential and originary co-belonging of Sein, Wort, Legen, Logos, Lesen, Schrift as Handschrift. So that's that alliance that I was speaking of before. And then just quoting a bit more Derrida. Moreover, this co-belonging that gathers all of these together stems from the very movement of gathering that Heidegger always reads, here as elsewhere, in Legen and in Lesen. This gathering motif governs the meditation of Geschlecht in the text on Trakl that I will evoke briefly. So that's already sort of an anticipation of one way that we get from the problematic of the typewriter, the question of the typewriter, to whatever is going on in Geschlecht III. So I hope that as I've been reading, as I've been talking here, your eyes have wandered over to the screen and to the typos that appear there. So as Derrida is quoting Heidegger saying, writing in its originating essence is handwritten or handwriting, the wrong key is struck repeatedly by Derrida in a collaboration of hand and machine that would seem to work precisely against the gathering thinking of writing that he's seeing in Heidegger, and what it means for Geschlecht and the proper of man, introducing already a kind of error and errancy into the writing of writing and its essence. So Heidegger's thinking of writing and handwriting, which goes hand in hand with his thinking of thinking as handwriting, that's a lot of thinking and writing together, so I'm going to say that again. Heidegger's thinking of writing and handwriting, which goes hand in hand with his thinking of thinking as handwriting. Right? So not only is writing essentially handwriting, therefore thinking is essentially handwriting, is remarked here in Derrida's typescript by type, and by another typographical thinking that we might also call already deconstruction. Which is to say that the encounter between Derrida and Heidegger in the Geschlecht series, I want to say, their crossed signatures, Derrida's reading of Heidegger, which he elsewhere describes as an overprinting or surimpression, is perhaps above all an encounter between two media regimes or protocols, two sets of Schreibzeug, and two types of hands. Only one of them can make typos, and only one of them can think the typo at work in Geschlecht. So there might be a methodological objection that you're already silently formulating to yourself right now, maybe even preparing as a question for the Q&A, which is something like, are we really going to read Derrida's typos? Are we really going to take them seriously? The man was a terrible typist, fine. Lots of people type badly, maybe even lots of philosophers type badly. What can the typo possibly have to do with his thought, with thinking, with philosophy, with Geschlecht, with all of the serious questions we're here to talk about? I obviously welcome these questions, but I'd ask you at least to think about what they might presuppose about writing, about the instruments of writing, and whether this order of question, which implicitly or explicitly banks on a thinking of writing as secondary or representative external to thought or logos, has not already been forcefully shaken by the work of Jacques Derrida, beginning, of course, in Of Grammatology. As I was writing this, I was also suddenly reminded of the sessions in La Vie, la Mort, Derrida's 1975-76 seminar that is going to be coming out in a couple months, in which he devotes considerable attention, what we could call serious attention, a reading in the strong sense, to a misprint in the French edition of Heidegger's Nietzsche. And I'll come back in a moment to another instance of Derrida calling attention in a very interesting way to another misprint. All this to say that from a methodological standpoint, I believe the typo to be not only a legitimate object of deconstructive reading, but a particularly strategic and even productive site of deconstructive reading that strikes at the heart of what something like deconstructive reading is. If the typo imposes itself in the Geschlecht series, this is not only because Derrida takes up Heidegger's rejection of the typewriter, but also more pressingly because of what is at work in this word or this mark, Geschlecht. This word, this mark, Geschlecht, this sounds familiar to you, I'm sure, because Derrida repeats this formulation over and over again in Geschlecht II and Geschlecht III, insisting on the difficulty or even the impossibility of speaking of any determinable referent of Geschlecht beyond this word or mark. But of course, Geschlecht is not just any word or mark. Derrida reminds us repeatedly that in the text of Geschlecht III, he reminds us repeatedly that typography, the graphic stamp and imprint, what writes by striking, are part of the Geschlecht family. As Rodrigo writes in his preface to Geschlecht III, the strike, blow, or imprint, Schlag, is what makes a Geschlecht for Heidegger, who displaces the meaning of Geschlecht towards its etymological family. Geschlecht and Geslati are the collective forms of the Old German Slat for Schlag. Right, so Geschlecht is the word that, as Rodrigo again puts it, remarks the mark, or we could add retypes the type. And you'll recall that for Heidegger in the Trakl essay, there would be, and we've already seen this today, the right strike, the rechte Schlag, what Derrida translates as, following the existing French translation, in fact, the juste frappe that strikes Geschlecht. And of course, as we've already alluded to today, there is the second strike, the wrong strike, the mauvaise frappe, the typo, if you will, the faute de frappe, that comes to affect Geschlecht as if from the outside, introducing the war of the sexes, violent discord or dissension, which according to Heidegger leads to unbridled separation, or as Derrida glosses it, dissemination, bad dissemination. In session 10 of the Geschlecht III, Derrida maps this good-bad strike onto a thinking, and I'm not going to be able to piece together how he gets there here, but I'll refer you to it. Right, session 10, he maps the good-bad strike onto a thinking in Heidegger of good-bad writing, writing that's good, writing that's bad, that would make Heidegger's gesture, as he says, more Platonic and more Christian than it may seem. And we don't have to work hard to understand how the right strike of Geschlecht would be aligned with handwriting and its gathering handwork. This Heideggerian right strike would exclude not only the error or disseminating errancy of the typo, it would exclude from the start any mechanical keystroke, any typographical strike. For Heidegger, we could say the typewriter only makes typos. Right, it's a typo writer. Any typographical error would merely be a kind of symptom or exacerbation of this more essential errancy, the bad dissemination wrought by the copying machine. As Derrida points out, this would also entail an underlying scheme of the relation between essence and accident, of, for instance, the division that would come to affect some essentially undividable point or place, the tip of the spear, as if from outside. Derrida, for his part, in the formulation here, will insist that an accident is only possible if the essence is already somehow affected by it from the start. Si l'essence est accidentable, please note the typo, elle est a priori accidentée. So a typo as maybe another term for this kind of accident that would have to be already at work in the type. So as I've begun to suggest, we might understand Derrida's own thinking of Geschlecht as a thinking in type on the typewriter of the typo. I would formulate my hypothesis between two languages like this. I've said it before, no typos without, or no typos without typos. We have to be cautious here, however, not to simply oppose handwriting and typewriting in a gesture that would amount to a media technological metaphysics. As Derrida points out in the interview published in Paper Machine as the word processor, we cannot on the one hand think of handwriting as a pre-technological or pre-mechanical activity. This would be to sort of fall into precisely the Heideggerian opposition. Derrida says when we write by hand, we are not in a time before technology. On the other hand, when we type, we're of course still writing by hand, but according to another regime, another bodily economy, another technical configuration of hand and language. And yet, something happens to our thinking, as Nietzsche suggests, if we let it happen. If we answer the call, we could say, in this new collaboration, if we let the typo come. I'm gonna go to here. To give you an idea of just how bad Derrida's typing is, and the extent to which he's not only being hyperbolic or self-deprecating, he's of course being hyperbolic and self-deprecating, but not only that, when he admits in that interview from 2001 that he makes beaucoup de fautes. Here are roughly 10 lines from the typescript of the 1984-85 seminar. In these 10 or so lines, which are not at all atypical of Derrida's typing, we can count at least 24 typos. Mostly mistyped letters that are, in the majority of cases, caught by the typist, Derrida, who stops, reverses, corrects, creating a nearly constant impression of doubling or overprinting, a retyping of his own typing in his typescript. And you'll note that this particular piece of typescript is part of Geschlecht II and contains that term we saw earlier, the Schreibzeug, is down there. So Derrida, now we're going to do a little sort of history of Derrida on the typewriter here before we get back into meatier stuff. Derrida says that he first learned to type in 1956 in the United States. I learned to type quickly and badly in Cambridge at Harvard, where I spent a year after my time at the École, right, the ENS. Unlike Nietzsche, Derrida was not an early or necessarily overly willing adopter of the typewriter. He wrote his first books, including grammatology, longhand, only typing them when it came time to produce the final version. I bought my first typewriter in the United States in 1956. It was necessary for me to type. Il fallait que je tape. As if typing was somehow previously lacking in another kind of faute de frappe. It was in Cambridge, Massachusetts that Derrida purchased his first typewriter, which he describes in several places as a little Olivetti with an international keyboard. He remembers his typewriter in at least one instance as having been an Olivetti Lettera 32, a very well-known model of typewriter, little portable typewriter. But his memory of this Olivetti 32 turns out to itself contain something of an anamnesic typo, since the Olivetti 32 wasn't actually released until the mid-1960s, so Derrida couldn't possibly have bought one in Harvard, at Harvard in 1956. And it's in fact the 22 Olivetti that had the universal international keyboard that Derrida mentions using. Which he bought, he says, because there was no French keyboard available in the States. And I want to flag, because it's going to come back later, this issue of the international universal keyboard, the national keyboard, the French keyboard, the American keyboard, sort of all of those issues with their characters that are necessary to type in each language. And also have different configurations and require different sort of habits and trainings of the hand. In either case, this is the typewriter. This is not his exact typewriter, this is an image from Wikipedia, but this model of portable typewriter was Derrida's preferred model for over 2 decades. He says, I bought a little Olivetti 32, scratch that, make it 22, with an international keyboard because I couldn't find a French keyboard over there. Which means that for many years, from 1957 until the 70s, I had to take advantage of trips to the US to find the international keyboard I was accustomed to. I didn't know how to type on a French keyboard until the 1970s. I replaced a little Olivetti with a little Olivetti each time. It's in the late 60s, Derrida reports that he began using the typewriter not to copy his text that he had written by hand, and it began instead writing straight onto the machine, composing his first drafts of seminars and other texts directly on the typewriter. In 1979, starting with the postcard, Derrida switches from mechanical typewriter to an electric typewriter, and it's on the electric typewriter that the Geschlecht series was born, and on which at least the first 3 installments, Geschlecht 1, 2, and 3, will be typed quickly and badly with lots of mistakes. This is not to say that Derrida is careless when it comes to his texts. Nothing could be farther from the truth. In fact, other documents in the Derrida archive reveal an exacting, even obsessive concern for typographical precision in the printed editions of his texts. Derrida's personal copies of his own books in the Princeton Library, for instance, nearly all, almost every book, contain traces of a careful rereading and correction by hand of typographical errors and misprints, usually but not always in view of a subsequent edition of the book. And here, for example, is a list of 10 corrections that Derrida noted needed to be made in the second edition of De la Grammatologie. And we can see from the different pens and pencils used here, right, the different writing instruments, that these errors were recorded at different moments of rereading, right? So implying something sort of habitual, systematic, ongoing. And each is in turn, if you then go back through the book, corrected on the corresponding page of the volume. We can see, for example, if we go to page 290, that Derrida has caught the sign in an act of flagrant salvation, le salut du signe, which he corrects and brings down to its proper status, le statut du signe. Also folded into the pages of Derrida's own copy of Grammatology is a typed letter from Sam Weber, sent from Berlin and dated April 19th, 1969, which I'm just excerpting here in the place where Sam Weber alerts his friend to the more than 20 printing errors, faute d'impression, that he has caught. I will say that something I wasn't planning on saying, but I can't resist, is that he says, je peux signaler plus de 20 fautes d'impression, and he's offering to do that in exchange for if Derrida will send him 7 copies of Grammatology at a reduced price. So this is also a kind of exchange for his students in Berlin. But that's the deal that's being struck there. Right, but so Sam Weber has caught these 20 fautes d'impression, and probably no need to point out, because by now, of course, it's happening. Sam Weber himself makes a typo as he writes it. But the real reason I've taken us back to Grammatology, besides trying to show you that Derrida's typographical, and I would insist typographical practices are not given to unchecked error or errancy, is to call our attention to another typo or faute that is now invisible to us, but which Derrida confesses in another text you may be familiar with, Typewriter Ribbon, Limited Ink 2, and which sheds light, I think, on another important dimension of the typo that will take us eventually back to Geschlecht III. And we'll also point to, really crucially, something I don't have the time to develop here, but which I would be very excited to talk more about, the archival singularity and even what we could call the archival jouissance of the typo. The typo in question concerns the epigraph to the second part of the Grammatology from Rousseau's Confessions, J'étais comme si j'avais commis un inceste. So in Typewriter Ribbon, which was published in Papier Machine in French and in Without Alibi in English, Derrida recalls that when he was rereading this moment in the Confessions in the context of his 1997-98 seminar, Le Parjure et le Pardon, also forthcoming this fall, the 97-98 seminar, he says that a prodigious archive had just been exhumed in Picardy and then deciphered. The archive in question, and it's already striking that this is the word he uses to describe it, an archive. The archive was an insect trapped in amber. An insect surprised by death, captured and archived intact, at the very moment it was sucking the blood of another insect, some 54 million years before the appearance of humans on Earth. And allow me to quote at length here what Derrida says he finds remarkable about this insect archive. It's one thing, he says, to know the sediments, rocks, plants that can be dated to this timeless time when nothing human or even living signaled its presence on Earth. It's another thing to refer to a singular event, like that animal surprised by catastrophe at the moment, at some instant, at some stigmatic point of time in which it was in the process of taking its pleasure, sucking the blood of another animal. For there is also a report of 2 midges, other insects, immobilized in honey-colored amber when they were surprised by death as they made love. That's our Valentine's Day treat today. Honey-colored amber, 2 midges surprised by death as they made love. 54 million years before humans appeared on Earth, a jouissance took place whose archive we preserve. It happens to us again. It is still arriving to us. We have there, set down, consigned to a support, protected by the body of an amber coffin, the trace, which is itself corporeal, of an event that took place only once. So there would be a lot to say about this moment of archival insect jouissance that precedes and exceeds humans and human archival machinery by many millions of years, which we come across by surprise, Derrida had himself come across the mention of this discovery in a newspaper, the clipping of which is embedded in the pages of his seminar text, an archive we come across by surprise and are given to decipher. And I hope you'll forgive me if I pass over much of what would need to be said here about this archive in relation to Geschlecht, among other things, in more than one sense, and go directly to what Derrida says several pages further on in both the 97-98 seminar and in Typewriter Ribbon that touches directly on the question of the typo. And I've reproduced here the typescript of this moment from the 97-98 seminar in French. I'll read it in English. To be honest, I didn't even retype it myself. I cut and pasted it from the Word file that I believe was based on something Jeff had sort of salvaged from the file, the computer files, right?
Is that the right image? Is that the right image? Is that the one you want?
Oh, sorry. That one. Thank you. Right, so I put this up here for a couple reasons, one of which I'll get to, another of which is because I and some of the other people in this room are in the middle of rereading this very text for publication and doing, among other things, the work of scanning it for typos. But I'll read aloud the English translation of the version published in Typewriter Ribbon. So I'll keep the French here and I'll read the English. I didn't know a moment ago why I was telling you these stories of archives. Archives of a vampire, insect, archives of animals making love 54 million years ago, and archives as confessions. But yes, I think I remember now, even though it was first of all unconscious and came back to me only after the fact. It's because in a moment I'm going to talk to you about effacement and prostheses, about falsifications of the letter, about the mutilation of texts, of bodies of writing, etc. Now, and here you'll just have to believe me, because I'm telling you the truth, as always. When I quoted Rousseau in Of Grammatology in 1967 and wrote as an epigraph for that whole section, almost the whole book that I devoted to Rousseau, j'étais comme si j'avais commis un inceste. I was as if I had committed incest. Well, the first proofs of the book came back to me with a typographical error. I was tempted for a moment not to correct it. The compositor, in fact, had said, j'étais comme si j'avais commis un insecte. I was as if I had committed an insect. Perhaps the typo was meant to protect from incest, but to protect whom or what? A perfect anagram, inceste, insect, that in order to respect the grammatical machine, I had to resolve, to rectify, and to normalize. So, in this scene, the typo, here the French word that Derrida uses is not faute de frappe, but coquille, the word for shell, an animal word. This typo appears as what has been working on the text and on Derrida unconsciously and is itself recalled or exhumed, like those insects trapped in amber, as a moment of jouissance that tempts Derrida. I was tempted for a moment not to correct it, he says, but must in the end be normalized in order to respect the grammatical machine. Derrida insists that this faute was introduced not by him, but by the compositor or typesetter, not by his own bad typing. Although it's worth noting that this is not a text that he first composed on the typewriter. But this typographical substitution of letters, the one that turns inceste into insect, or rather the other way around, inceste into insect, also appears as a protection. It's a faute de frappe. And let us not forget that starting with the introduction of linotype and monotype typesetting machines, the composition of text when you set type is done on a keyboard that in every way resembles a typewriter. This faute de frappe on the part of the typesetter is meant to protect from another faute, the unavowable fault or sin of incest. It's worth noting here too, go back to the page, it's worth noting that another typo, this one, presumably Derrida's own, actually remains in the text of De la Grammatologie. It also remains in the Partial Pardon seminar. It also remains in the published versions of the Typewriter Ribbon in French and in English. And it's something that those of us who spend a lot of time with our eyes on early modern French are probably more sensitive to than others, namely the fact that the first verb here, j'étais, I was, is given in Rousseau's old spelling with the OIS ending. Whereas the second verb, the verb that commits the incest, or the insect, is modernized to the AIS ending. As if the first verb remained trapped in that honey-colored amber of 18th century orthography, an insect caught in the act of sucking blood or making love, while the second verb has been modernized, normalized, we might also add repressed. I should also note that the word Derrida uses, go back to this text, the word he uses for typo, coquille, the shell, and this is totally idiomatic in French. You say une coquille, it's a misprint, it's a typo. There's nothing unusual about it. But that word here, especially, I think, evokes the animal form that comes to protect itself, right? It protects us, but it also protects itself with that hardened case that reverses or turns in on itself. A reversal or turning that is in fact one of the proposed etymologies of this word as it's used to mean typo. The other proposed, and it's one of these terms that people sort of, invent these fanciful etymologies for why do we say coquille for misprint. So one of them is this form of the shell that turns in on itself, and the other one is the sort of counterfeiting or falsification of shells used on the St. James Way. So you know that the coquille is the emblem of the Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage path, and it's what marks the path, and people would come back sort of false shells, either as, sort of claiming that they had made the pilgrimage, but in fact they hadn't. And so there's this substitution or falsification of the shell of St. James. It's one of the other proposed etymologies.
Which is also St. Jack.
Yeah. Voila. Anyway, what I want to say here is that the faute, right, the faute de frappe, the coquille that covers up another faute, the faute of incest, right, would take us to a scene of Geschlecht in which its many senses seem to fold or turn in on each other. Sexual difference, family, generation, lineage, clan, house, species. We have this kind of animal, incestuous family convergence here happening with incest, insect, in a way that is, and I think Derrida's narrative of his encounter with this typo gives us this sense, forbidden, sinful, transgressive, guilty, wrong, fautif, faulty, maybe also unforgivable. This faute, of course, also haunts Geschlecht III in many ways, and Alyssa has already pointed us in this direction in the Q&A before lunch, right? Notably in the incestuous relationship between Georg Trakl and his sister Greta, that is alluded to by Trakl in various poems, that's been attested by biographers and literary critics of Trakl, which does not show up in Geschlecht III, but which seems to mark Heidegger's own thinking of a gentle twofold of sexual difference, a relationship between Geschlechter, between brother and sister, that would be innocent. We could say a frappe without faute. Strikingly, again, the word incest appears nowhere in Geschlecht III, the text which, as we know, Derrida kept referring to as forthcoming, yet never himself revised or put into print or retyped or read aloud, but only read aloud to our knowledge one time, leaving us with only this typescript with its typos still intact, still stamped into a singular archive that was only exhumed many years later by Rodrigo from the Derrida archive. Derrida's typos in Geschlecht then remain still visible to us and still legible. In a sense, even though we of course had to, as editors, normalize them, they remain, I think, not quite normalized. And this would be sort of alluding to, again, the status of Geschlecht, the unborn status of Geschlecht that Alyssa was telling us about. So I showed you the transcription of the 97-98 seminar, or that text that I pulled from the files that Jeff recovered, mostly to show you how few typos appear in it. I don't know if you noticed that. I hope you did. We can go back to it. There are effectively none. Mostly just kind of random spaces that are left in, and I actually don't know if those are, we could say, native to the text, or if they're an effect of the conversion process. By contrast, this. Right, so in 2001, Derrida is still describing himself as typing very quickly and very badly, right? So the reason we don't have typos is more of a technological order. right? This typescript of the 97-98 seminar was, of course, not produced on a typewriter, but on a computer with a word processor, with all the writing tools, the Schreibzeug, that we now use today on an hourly basis. Of course, the delete key, the spell check, the autocorrect. So no, the typo doesn't survive the computer in a real way, not really, and gives way to another kind of normalization. In fact, in Geschlecht III, in 1984-85, we're already in what we might call the twilight of Derrida's typewriter. Derrida pinpoints this exact moment, 1984-85, as the beginning of what he calls his organized resistance to the computer, to which he finally capitulated 2 years later. By the fall of 87, when Derrida began the fourth and final year of the Philosophical Nationality and Nationalism seminar sequence, he's already begun typing out his lecture courses on his little Mac. So the little Olivetti has given way to the little Mac. So these seminars, this seminar sequence and the Geschlecht series in particular, marks the end of the typewriter for Derrida, and thus also a certain end of the typo, or the Faute de Frappe, like the 27 typos you might have counted up here on this page, where Derrida discusses precisely the typographical spacing that comes to affect Trakls ein Geschlecht, in that particularly, or we might say idiomatically, German typographical convention of emphasizing text not with italics, but with a space between each letter. And Derrida calls our attention to that, doesn't do as much with it as we might have liked. Rodrigo's recently written on it. A typographical spacing that, as Rodrigo observes, Heidegger's own text actually erases, right? So Trakl puts those spaces between the EIN of ein, that's his way of emphasizing it. Heidegger's own text, when he reproduces it, when he quotes it, erases it by putting that same word in italics, right? So using not the traditional German typographical convention of spacing, but using the Roman, essentially what was adopted everywhere outside of Germany typographically, using italics for emphasis instead, right? So Heidegger's own text erases the word by putting it in italics, erases the typographical movement, a gesture that reveals itself, in quoting Rodrigo, to be phonocentric, as Heidegger implicitly hears the emphasis on the ein, the betont, the emphasis, as indicative of the fundamental tone of Trakl's poetry as a whole. So for the sake of time, I can't give this moment the reading it deserves, but gesture only in the wake of what Rodrigo has written about it toward the way in which, even as Heidegger seems to be paying close attention to typographical elements in Trakl's text, his punctuation, the fact that the ein is the only emphasized word, he misses or overlooks or protects himself from the spacing that would divide the gathered one of one Geschlecht, resulting in a thinking of Geschlecht aligned with his own rejection of the typewriter that can only read the right strike but not the wrong one, and thus suffers from what I would call in French a different kind of faute de frappe, a kind of lack or want of the strike. There's not enough strike in Heidegger that still needs to be restruck, retyped by another reading. I'd like to conclude by taking stock of one particular word that's particularly subject to typographical error in the typescript of the text that will become Geschlecht II and III. That word, perhaps not surprisingly, is the word or mark Geschlecht, the word that remarks the mark, retypes the type, restrikes the strike with a single keystroke. Derrida mistypes it over and over and over again. Not in exactly the same way, but in a number of different ways. As if his fingers that had learned to type on a universal international keyboard can't quite learn or adapt themselves to typing on the national and nationalist machinery of Geschlecht. Right, so the mark instead often becomes something like Geschlecht, Geschlecht. At times, Derrida just gives up typing it altogether, and it simply becomes G. The G of G, the writing of this word G and our G, the word G names the G, exclamation point. What does seem to be strikingly consistent, though, in Derrida's mistypings of Geschlecht is the place of the typo. And I hope you'll hear this place of the typo in a potential resonance with Heidegger's place with the ought, the place of the poem. I would say Derrida's own thinking of place, or the way he's trying to think against Heidegger's thinking of place, is something like the place of the typo. So what is the place of Derrida's typo in Geschlecht? Well, it's precisely at the place of the Schlag, in the Geschlecht, which is to say precisely where a Geschlecht bears the mark of the imprint or strike. It's also what we might call the particularly or peculiarly German heart of the word, not only the way Heidegger reads it, the way he reads that Schlag out of it, but in this idiomatically German cluster of 4 consonants, the Schle, which I would call a kind of the Deutschmark of Geschlecht, that coins or stamps Geschlecht as its own word, and would be apt to trip up German fingers, non-German fingers, unaccustomed to typing that cluster of consonants, right? And you can kind of, my image here is almost of typewriter keys, when they jam from having too many, from coming at once, which is also the reason why the keys are spread out the way they are. You might know that whole story. So it's at this cluster that Derrida, the foreigner, who bought his own first typewriter abroad with its universal international keyboard, and who is writing this text on an electric typewriter with a French keyboard, it's at this consonant cluster that his fingers find their faute repeatedly. As if we could say the idiomaticity of Geschlecht, its national type, made itself felt, first of all, as a faute de frappe, in the keystrokes of a hand that thinks with the machine and that strikes at the heart of philosophical nationalism. So we began with Nietzsche, and I'd like to give him the final word. In 1882, Nietzsche wrote a little poem on his typewriter about his typewriter. Before I read this, I'd like to note that the Hansen writing ball, produced outside of Germany, its inventor was from Copenhagen, and it was not yet produced, there was no German production of typewriters in 1881. The Hansen writing ball wrote only in Roman-style capital letters, a type of type often in Germany throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries seen in contrast to black letter or Frakturtype as modern, international, and un-German, specifically un-German, until of course 1941, when the Nazi Party infamously declared Fraktur, the black letter, to be Jewish letters and imposed the use of Roman type in Germany. On February 16th, 1882, Nietzsche types in all caps, "The writing ball is a thing like me, made of iron, yet easily twisted on journeys." His writing ball had been damaged en route to him. Patience and tact are required in abundance, as well as fine fingers to use us. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. I'm gonna ask you a first question.
Yeah.
My prerogative. I really enjoyed it, and I have a question that's maybe, it's not a topic that's in the seminar as such, but I think that it's sort of pressing here. What is the role of speed and acceleration in the story that you're giving? Because you brought up that line, "Je tape très vite."
Yeah.
And it occurs to me that, like, on the one hand, if we're really going to problematize this distinction that Heidegger seems to want to maintain between handwriting and machine writing, right? You'd have 2 temporalities, 2 speeds, and if we're really going to problematize that, right? Of course, there always must have been speed. And yet, I think when Derrida says, "Je tape très vite," and we can think of other essays like No Apocalypse Not Now, right, where there's always speed, and yet there's a specificity within any kind of technical domain of accelerations and of the necessity of thinking the specificity of, vitesse. So I guess I'm just curious about like the acceleration of the typo, and whether on tape toujours très vite, or whether this is, how do we take the, does that make sense?
Yeah,
and then I guess it's just the figure of the insect in its like the photographic insect in amber that's like preserved and like icy, right? And that would be a kind of like what is the speed of that, or is that like the right? What kind of preservative, non-accelerated image is that? That's a lot, but
that's too many interesting things at once. So
yeah.
I'll just like throw some responses back at you inadequately. My very first thought as you began talking, and it's not at all developed, but what was to those words gentle and tender in the kind of sexual difference that, of course, Heidegger is pointing, or difference between any Geschlechter, right? Not just sexual difference, right? So that gentle, tender, and it's not necessarily slow, right? I don't think slow is and there's any kind of explicit slowness there. But it's certainly, I think we can certainly read the gentle, tender in light of, if we kind of put Geschlecht II back in dialogue with Geschlecht III, is a kind of anti-technological, it's a certain resistance to modernization, to technology, right? So all of that, and so I think we could probably get a certain slowness out of it if we squeezed it.
Right.
But I don't have anything really better to say about that for now. Remind me of the next thing that you said, because I haven't.
Well, just like je tape très vite. So like, how do we? Is there something? Is that vite?
Yeah. Okay. What I wanted to say is, I think there's a really weird temporality to his typing, right? Because il tape très vite, mais très mal, and if you type vite and mal, if you do what he does, almost in every occasion is you have to stop and reverse and correct, right? And so there's in fact a kind of strange slowness and care that imposes itself as this superimposition or overprinting on the bad typing, right? And so then we have to ask ourselves, what is that first vitesse that then has to be slowed down, reversed, slowed down, the lag that then has to happen, why so quickly, what's pushing, what's pressing, what's driving the fast that produces the bad, especially when there's such an imperative of care, correction, normalization also.
Right.
And so that I hadn't thought about at all. I'd only looked at the mal and not the vite, and that'll give me a lot to think about.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Too many. I'm just going to go left to right. So Derrida and yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Fascinating. Really, really enjoy it. Just things that may be of use to you or not. I was thinking, of course, that we seem to be here again. This kind of good writing and bad writing. So we have this image of Heidegger just sitting with his ink pen, and then poor Derrida just struggling with a typewriter, right? An ink pen is also a tool, and
sure.
it just it can drop a lot of insect shit around it. So I wonder if we could trace also maybe not typos in that sense, but manchas. So that I think that it's interesting. And then the other thing is that it seems to be that Heidegger, well, you said it, that refuses to write with the typewriter, or doesn't want to, or doesn't like it, because for him the handwriting is that puts us in the path of language thought, blah blah blah. When in the 20s the typewriter is like the tool at the I'm thinking Tina Modotti's picture of Juan Meya's typewriter. So it's the instrument to disseminate many things around, no? But it's not that difficult, that different. The say the fountain pen, or the typewriter, or even the electrical typewriter. So all these actually are helping in different protocols and in different language, body language. That's true. What do we have now? Like it's the pen, let's say the Apple pen, or the
like a stylus.
This is not helping us. This is helping itself. And I think it's just absolutely fascinating. You see, that's what I'm thinking, right? So that it's the technology has changed. We don't have that anymore. We don't have this piece. It's gearing into already a direction that we are now, but it is different. And this is just thoughts that came with you where I was listening to your very wonderful talk.
Well, I want to go back in response to this. Well, actually, here first, before we go anywhere, just this, the writing ball and the way that the letters are sort of springing out, and then I want to go back to that Olivetti ad. This is an ad for the Olivetti 22, right? In which there's I mean, it's an advertisement of the typewriter as a disseminating machinery in a way, I'm going to keep saying scatter and hope that Jeff doesn't shoot me eye daggers when I say it, but right, there's some kind of scattering going on. And the thing that I think Geschlecht III encourages us to think is a kind of topology of typography and of these different writing tools. And in that interview, the word processor, Derrida talks about, before he began to type, that he himself was very, let's say, compelled by or indulged in a certain fantasy of the pen, which he describes in exactly the same way as he does that tip of the spear, la pointe de l'épée, in the way that place where everything is gathered, was also the tip of the pen. Of the writing pen. And so I think that possibility of that ink spillage and the kind of scattering of ink that would happen in writing is, we could say, a kind of material reality, but not part of the kind of fantasized topology of handwriting here. But that certainly ignores many kind of lived realities of handwriting, especially with like an ink pen and that you dip, and of course it's all kinds of messy and difficult and technical and requires a whole series of gestures. Yeah, thank you.
So I was thinking of Nietzsche, Nietzsche, the idea of thinking of the suspension of grammar, right? And then thinking of the idea of the typo as a mistake, of an error, as an interruption of meaning. So full meaning, right? And precisely technology will be the place of no mistake, no thinking, and no error, precisely because technology says to correct this kind of non-human lapsus of technology, right? So, but, and then thinking of Geschlecht II, right? The idea of the monster. You remember when Derrida is making joke about the Heidegger and the thinking of this man with just one hand, right? Because it's all the emphasis is on the hand, but the hand and not the two arms, just the hand, right? Do you know how Derrida type? You use the whole 10 fingers or just two of them?
I think
maybe Joe, you remember that? Because it's quite different to write,
No, I think he used the list fingers.
Okay.
Yeah, well, but it's very interesting. I mean, there is the one versus two hands. There would be a lot to say about that, because for Heidegger, it's a thinking of the hand and not the two hands. And I know Rodrigo's been thinking lately about the kind of the pleasurable dimensions or a certain erotics of the two hands that seems to be cut off or maybe repressed by the one
And when
hand.
he describes the manuscript or the typescript that he did not read at Loyola, he writes in French, tapuscrit dactylographié, which is translated as simply typed.
Right.
But we get the dactylos.
Right, it's the splitting. I mean, that's also what you're getting here is the finger, right, the move to the digital. But I will say, I mean, this is kind of off on a tangent from what you're talking about, but the terminology that's not always used, but sometimes used in French for the kind of errors you make on a computer, right? Because it's, right, we think of technology as being this kind of silencing of the noise of error, but in fact it just generates right, different kinds of errors. But one of the terms in French is erreur de saisie. Right, and that saisie is from the saisir, the way you kind of enter or input data in French is the grasping, which is that word that of course is so central in Geschlecht II. And then at the end of Geschlecht III, he actually, this is new terminology, but he kind of throws it up in the air and doesn't do a lot with it. But I think that would be a whole other path to go down.
Okay, we're gonna keep going around. I think Ian and then Michael, Alberto, Armando. So wherever.
So I guess I'm going to ask, I think, a similar question, but I really just am looking for clarification. It seems like there would be two options with what you presented. One is that the advent of the typewriter, this language of Schlag, Geschlecht, reveals something kind of intrinsic to all notions of writing or sort of recording, right, from drawing in the stands to using a pen. And I guess I'm wondering whether you agree with that, or if we were to take slips of the pen as our sort of primary metaphor and then try to develop a kind of logic, unpack that, whether you think that there would get anything different, maybe essentially different.
Essentially different, I would say no.
No, okay.
Right, but because I think that is going to, put us back in a position where we think about, writing as having some kind of essence, which is then sort of altered, affected, damaged by the accident of this new technology, right? That invention would be something that would befall it and then somehow, affect it, and it would be, a kind of secondary thing, and that we have to think it from a more originary place. But then it's very difficult to say how we go about describing what happens, or if we use the language of, right, if the schlag is revealed by the typewriter, if the schlag is, somehow made, given a kind of eventness by the typewriter, if it's made phenomenal by the typewriter in some way. That's something that I thought a lot about and should be in a position to say more about right now, but I'm not. I think it's extremely difficult.
So I have two quick things. The first is I feel like there might be room for some essential difference between writing with a pen and a typewriter. I mean, I think maybe a pen, the ink flows onto the page, and this is more of a pounding into the page. Maybe that makes sense, but it probably doesn't, so I don't know. So I have a clarification question concerning what is a typo. I like this idea that it's a disruption of meaning, but it seems like there are instances where the meaning is expressed perfectly fine, and that maybe there's some value in retaining the misspelling or something, and that's something that you discussed. I also thought it was really interesting to say like the G word or something, right? I think there's something interesting in the idea that he doesn't want to type Geschlecht for some reason. How do you know what's a typo?
Yeah, well, that would require a typology, right?
Yeah.
It would send us. It's right there within the problematic. Is what counts as, what is the type of the typo? What marks itself as a typo? That's not something that I've developed, but I think, I started to, so actually when I showed the Sam Weber letter and I said there's a typo, I was about to say, okay, it's actually not a typo, it's a grammatical error. Then I didn't want to make fun of Sam Weber's French. Then I didn't want to say, well, we have to make some kind of rigid distinction between the grammatical error and the typo, because of the typo is of course also participating in what we could call a grammatical error of.
Are they the same? Do you find them? Okay.
I don't, what do you think?
It's a matter of intentionality, right?
Is it? Because then, I mean, you could just say, oh,
right,
I meant to do that. Right?
What kind of a faute is it, right? What kind of an error? If you meant to type it and you look at it and you don't see it as a mistake, does it still count as a typo? Is it only a kind of, reverse letters or something being misplaced? Is it a matter of sort of position or merely the wrong key being struck? I think it's a really interesting question. What would be the kind of limits of the typo? I don't think we could draw any kind of very strict boundary around it.
On the other side, Heideggers. Sorry. Someone else has asked.
I am fascinated by your figure, stopping, going back and around, getting behind the word, imprinting on the word. So I wanted to ask you if those insects, cutting amber, making laugh, is that coitus ergo, like Socrates and Plato? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, maybe.
Well, what about going back and getting on the word from behind and all that?
Yeah, well, I think it's certainly some kind of non-reproductive pleasure that's going on. Yeah. Did you want to say more about that?
No.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I'm reaching for my writing machine here. So I had a quick comment on Adam's speed question with regard to Nietzsche's fine fingers. I can't remember where it is, and I looked in my memory machine, whatever, I couldn't find it. He says to read philologically is to read with sensitive fingers. And I'm wondering if there's the tactility of the imprint here has a connection with legibility and reading. The other thought I had was whether you think that there can be a Geschlecht, a line of descent between Derrida's typewriter and the two-handed mystic writing pad. That is a writing machine and
yes,
a complex figure for the psyche, and whether that influences the thinking, right, as he goes, which is sort of the thing that he asks about with Freud, in Archive Fever, like how would email affect, the model or whatever.
Well, the first thing I want to say in response to that is that, I was going to say, and then didn't necessarily want to kind of open up that whole can of worms was if there's anything that authorizes sort of a reading of the typo in this maybe sort of Nietzschean line, it would be Freud in the scene of writing, right? And what happens there with the mystic writing ped. Maybe that's all I'll say.
Sure.
Oh, this is just an anecdotal remark that I understood something, seeing that image of the Olivetti, which I'd never understood before, which is a feature of Derrida's typing that always irritated me, and which is that all through, I believe, to the end, certainly up until the late 80s, and I think probably beyond that, he would never type the digit, the number 1. And if you look on the Olivetti there isn't one.
There's no one.
And maybe this was common on little manual typewriters, I don't know. The way he would do that number is to type a lowercase l.
Oh, L. Yeah.
And the lowercase l looks pretty much like the digit 1 on the typescript. But if you carry on doing that on a computer, it doesn't look right. The spacing goes strange. And on the text that you showed from the seminar that I'd retrieved from his hard drive, where you said there are hardly any typos, there is indeed an example of a lowercase l in the date 1967, I think. And in some cases that went further still, which is that if anybody has access to a copy of the first edition of the book that Derrida and I wrote together, in the very last part of that book, which has a lot of dates and biographical facts, which I was supposed to have written, but of course he wrote, and supplied to the Édition du Seuil in computerized form, a number of the dates printed in the book reproduce that lowercase l instead of the figure 1.
Well, and their G is not Geschlecht.
So there is no one, there are just L's.
Yes.
That's nice.
Yes, there is no one.
This problem reemerges with
One for dissemination.
No, ein.
when you search Google Books, right, and you look for D's, you'll get CLs too. Like it can't differentiate because it can't read the difference. Yeah, what are you doing?
Katie, I wanted to ask, well, it was one question and a comment. Can you go back to the opening slide, the one that is, yeah.
This one?
So am I right in thinking that when you look at that tube thing or tip thing, am I right in thinking that you can't really know which letter he types second?
Yeah, well, we talked about because they're both options for transliteration, right? And you told me that it's the U that would be more common in French? No,
Well,
the Y would be the
The way I think the French would transliterate the Greek tube thing would be with a Y. In English, it would be with a U.
With a U.
But like when you look at it from a graphic standpoint, can you see can we guess which one he typed second and which one he typed first, or does it really?
I mean, a lot of
remain
times you
undecided?
can. We'd have to get the better image of this that's not like all watermarked out. I think the U is over it. But often it's darker, where it's even done multiple times in this kind of insistent way.
So sometimes you can tell. In fact.
Yeah.
Okay. I was hoping you would say no, you can't.
No, in some cases like this, especially where there's no sort of definitive correct letter, right? Like in an instance of transliteration, then I think you have a much better case for undecidability.
Yeah, it just might be interesting because then he might thought he made a typo and now he's correcting the typo, but in correcting the typo he's introducing a typo in. But the thing that I really wanted to say was your talk made me think of how he describes Heidegger's cheminement as a cheminement typé, which we had a lot of trouble translating, and I think we ended up going with just a typed path. And of course, Heidegger's cheminement literally is anything but typé. And it just made me think of the overall problematic in Geschlecht III, where Derrida will often point out that Heidegger, when speaking of Frappe, is speaking of himself, a logic that he himself, as it were, falls prey to, because he can not speak of himself when speaking of of Heidegger. Just made me think that the cheminement typé that he ascribes to Heidegger is really his.
It's his own. Well, I want to say, right, he's reading Heidegger with the typewriter.
Yeah.
Is the gesture. Yeah.
I think we have time for one last question, and then we'll.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was amazing. I have like a weird question and then a clarification question. Given everything, why do you think the word typo doesn't exist in French? Like that we have to have faute de frappe and coquille, but that given the type, the typology, that all of the racines are there, that typo has to be an imported word. So that's kind of one thing, is that because, je tape, cheap, I mean, they're not exactly the same, but.
Well, and that might actually be the answer. It might be the coincidence in English of typing as the verb.
As in a typo.
Right.
And also
which also comes into English at the same time as the typo. They both are late 19th century words. I mean, to type was a transitive verb that existed in English that predates by centuries the typewriter, but it only takes on that sense, right, as you might expect with the typewriter.
And then, this is the other thing, but just very quickly, you might recall that Roland Barthes describes faute de frappe, typos as much lapsus of the unconscious as slips of the pen. He doesn't privilege the pen over that. But the other thing was to go back to that insect and to the singularity was the word you used of the jouissance. And
I think it's his word too.
Yeah. Could you just say, I think I might have lost the plot a little bit there with the insect in amber, and just say more about that archival insect?
Well, I wanted to see the typo as, kind of very crudely, just see the typo, every typo, as this insect, but not even the one insect, but the insect sucking the blood of the other, or the insects making love, that there's some kind of pleasurable, but also vampiric and maybe also incestuous.
But then would there be an iteration of the typo? Once you have the typo, can that be iterated?
Well, this is what's super interesting about the typo, is it's where the type, which is, defined by its iterability, would seem to, undo itself or produce something untypable.
Right.
Right. But so, and then, it's another reason that I wanted to go, sorry, I'll do this quickly, Adam, to all of the different ways. He repeats the mistyping of Geschlecht, but there are also like 20 iterations of the mistyping of Geschlecht. It's not always the same mistake. It's not like, he always goes for the J.
There, around the I.
It is, right? It's gathered in the same place, but not in a totally kind of mechanically in the vulgar sense.
That's a Heideggerian demonstration of the ort there.
Yeah, it's just like right. It's totally magnetized into that place.
Yeah,
with the metal.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Katie. 10 minutes, and then.